All right, you're live.
Okay, hello, this is Dyke Hendrickson, and I'm here with Life Along the Merrimack. We haven't been here lately, as you probably know, with all the challenges of the flu and with many closing down, but we're back up today, and I'm glad to be here. I am informed by producer Tyler Newhall that this is the 50th version of Life Along the Merrimack, so that's very good. I'm proud of that and proud to be back here talking with you. We're going to be talking a little about the Coast Guard today, in part because I've written a book, New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Patriots. You can see the cover. And why I think it's interesting is because Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. It was founded here in 1790, and this is the vessel that you're looking at. The Massachusetts was the first Coast Guard vessel. It was 60 feet long, built right here in Newburyport, right behind where the custom hit. Was created so that Alexander Hamilton and George Washington could collect some tariffs. So we're going to go through a bunch of slides. Again, Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. The Merrimack River has a huge history in American history, and this is part of where it starts. The book includes a lot of pictures, and this is one of them, one of my favorites. It's a buoy tender taken up in Rockland, Maine, and buoy tenders, keep places like Gloucester, Newburyport, and Portsmouth and Portland. All these places, they have to have good buoys these days with lights, and because, as always, a lot of mariners need some guidance on how to get into the harbor. So that's 170 feet long, 175 feet long, and it's very valuable to the Coast Guard. Here is another picture I like about the Coast Guard. This is an example of an exercise that took place off the coast, and I think you can see it. There's a helicopter and a vessel, and they're practicing dropping a swimmer into the water so they can pick up people who are under duress. This is practice, but we do have pictures of the real thing. The Massachusetts, which we just mentioned, was a key reason why this community was designated as birthplace of the Coast Guard. There were 10 vessels approved by Washington and Hamilton. This was the first one to be finished, and it is called the Massachusetts, and it was built here in Newburyport. Alexander Hamilton, who you might know from the Broadway show, if nothing else, was the Secretary of the Treasury in those days. He wanted ships such as the Massachusetts to be able to go into colonial waters and collect tariffs and cut down on smuggling. He did that. It was very successful. He was from the West Indies, actually, and he knew a lot about trade, and he knew a lot about smuggling. He was very effective. And Alexander Hamilton is the father of the Coast Guard. And there have been numerous vessels named after him, Hamilton. There's a dorm at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, named the Alexander Hamilton Dorm. So he looms large in the history of the Coast Guard and the Merrimack River. Here's an example of what we're talking about. This is downtown in Newburyport. It starts off, as you can see, near this site was the beginning of the U.S. Coast Guard. And so it is marked, and if you ever go down to the park near the boardwalk, you will see that. And if you've been to Newburyport, you'll know that things have improved there. And here's the relatively new area, the Harbor Master's shack, not shack, it used to be called a shack, it's a headquarters now, is to the right. And in the foreground is really a poignant memorial to fishermen on the North Shore who have died since 2000. And there are about 7 or 8 of them, and their names are here. So that's, a beautiful testimony to the lost fishermen. And over the years, Newburyport and many coastal communities lost thousands of fishermen and mariners. Here is talking about a loss. This was a vessel, the Bounty. You may remember it. It got a lot of publicity. It visited Newburyport in about 2010, 2012. And in 2012, it was refurbished up in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine. It came down, it went toured the North Shore a little bit, and then it went down to New London, Connecticut, which is the area of where the Coast Guard Academy is. At that time, a hurricane was, offshore, but the captain ignored a lot of the good information and decided he'd head for Florida, the destination anyway. He had a commercial obligation down there, and he ran into a hurricane off of North Carolina, and this is taken by the Coast Guard, and this is when the vessel is under extreme duress, as you can see. This was the captain. He was from Montpelier, Vermont, and as we said, he ignored an older ship that had been built in 1960 for the movie Mutiny on the Bounty with Marlon Brando and others. He ignored this good information and essentially sailed into a hurricane. And these are the two who were lost. Captain Walbridge, of course, and then Claudine Christian. They were the two of the 16 who were not saved. Her body was recovered. She was rushed to the hospital in She was 42. She was not a professional lark, but she was doing something just for an adventure. And she was lost in the heavy waves and the heavy sea. Eventually, her body was found, but she did not survive. Now, she is a distant relative of Fletcher Christian, who was a key character in Mutiny on the Bounty. And so the media, in addition to following his tragedy, did play up the fact that Fletcher Christian's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter was lost in a tall ship off of North Carolina. As part of my research for the book, New England Coast Guard Stories, I talked to a lot of coasties. This was one, Jane Pena, who was in North Carolina at 5 a.m. in her bunk where was she supposed to be. And they all got the call and they said, there's a ship going down. And I talked to her. She was very cooperative. For a journalist author like myself, it's important to have cooperative people. And she would talk, she would call me from where she was. And so I said, what is the first thing you did? And she said, well, we all went online to see what the vessel looked like. We couldn't believe anything was out there in this hurricane. But at 5 a.m, they got up and they went off. Now you can see in the background the photo, Kodiak, Alaska. When she was in North Carolina, then she was shipped off to Alaska, and she was in Mobile, Alabama, the last time I talked to her. Here is lowering the swimmer down. We just saw a slide on that shows what it looked like from a distance. This is actually happening. This is the Bounty. This was part of the rescue. So the swimmer is lowered down and he finds his equilibrium and he heads out to rescue some people, put them in, on his back or in a basket, and they pull them up. And the difficult situation here was the seas were running high. There's gusts of, 80 to 90 knots. And so it's a very difficult situation. But this is an example of him going into the water. This is not an actual picture of that rescue, but this is what it looks like. This is, you have two people in the water to the lower left, and here's your swimmer going in there. One good thing about the situation with the lifeboats, but the lifeboats had canvas roofs on them, so they weren't taking in a lot of water. They didn't have to bail the whole time. And as I understand it, when one of the swimmers in the Bounty rescue got to the first lifeboat, he stuck his head in and said, "I understand some of you might want to ride back to shore." And so you can imagine these people are shivering, they're scared, they're cold, and face pops in. Someone might want some transportation back to shore. So I had to laugh at that. And they did get 14 of 16 back. When we talk about rescues, a lot of the rescuing work started on the North Shore. This is two dates we have here. The Humane Society started on the North Shore in about 1788. They would, if they heard something, they go to Plum Island. The picture, however, is from 1892 off of Plum Island. And this is actually a photograph. I find it difficult to believe that sometimes. It's because if you know composition, you have smaller vessels going out. You even have some seagulls in the air. You have a vessel having trouble. But this is what rescue looked like more than a century ago. And another rescue off of New England took place in 1952. It was captured in a movie, The Finest Hours. You folks may have seen that. The Coast Guard team was very courageous and kept up their work and saved more than 24 people. This is a little more of a typical scene here, Coast Guard vessel going up to a pleasure craft. I must say, though, that since 9/11 in 2001, the Coast Guard doesn't tow many vessels in. They'll go and check with the vessel here, see how things are going, make sure there's no health emergency. But if they've run out of gas or they've lost a rudder, the Coast Guard will call in to a commercial group like Towboat USA, and they'll be able to see what they can do from there. But the Coast Guard has a lot of responsibilities now, and they rarely would tow in a vessel like this. When we talk about rescues and when we talk about the sea, we've always got to have at least one old salt. Now, this is an old salt if I ever saw one. He got many medals. Joshua James did, a native of Hull. He lived on the shore from 1826 until just about the turn of the century. He saved hundreds of lives and was rewarded, not financially, of course, but he was honored many times. Ida Lewis was also a great lifesaver. She lived off of Newport Road. She lived in the lighthouse off of Newport. And so partly because she grew up with it, she became a great lifesaver, very well known in Southern New England and a real hero to many people she helped. Here is Ida Lewis this is not a photo, obviously. This is a painting. She's helping. She's providing good help. There seem to be a few people in the stern of the vessel who have been helped already. And so this is an example of what rescue may have looked like. The rescue service, which we were talking about, came together with the regular Coast Guard in 1915. Now, the word Coast Guard didn't exist until 1915. There's the Revenue Service, which you talked about, which looked for smuggling and that type of thing. There was a life-saving service, which started, and then in 1915 and then 1939, these two groups merged with the lighthouse service. So you have life-saving, lighthouse, and you had the life-saving group as well. So the word Coast Guard came into play in 1915. In 1922, I was going to say, as the World War I started, from 1914 to 1918, the Coast Guard took in women as assistants. Here, the Baker twins in Washington, D.C., and they were clerical staff, but among the first women who were ever in the Coast Guard. As we go up in terms of time, that last photo is from about 1917. This is the 1930s, actually 1929. This photo was taken. The Coast Guard was really under duress during Prohibition, and that lasted from 1920 to 1933. There are many harbors in New England, many small streams, and people would smuggle liquor in, and it was a great challenge for the Coast Guard. They were always under the gun, and sometimes actually got into gun fights. There was a famous fight off of Plum Island, and a coaster was actually killed. Going up to World War II, here are some spars, they call themselves, Semper Paratus, always ready. That's the Coast Guard motto, and many women came forward during World War II, were great aid, mostly clerical, although there were some people in the Arctic looking for German subs. But this is an example from the 40s. Women really came forward. There were more than 10,000 women in the Coast Guard during World War II. And if you just think about the administrational challenge of getting 10,000 women in, identified, sent to training, sent to orientation, and then given jobs. They did a terrific job. One of the most beautiful sights in the Coast Guard these days is a picture of the Eagle. This, curiously enough, was built in the Germans in the 30s and was taken a war prize by the US in 1946. The Coast Guard cadets now train on it. It's based in New London, Connecticut. And curiously, the Coast Guard officers, still want coasties to know how to navigate by the stars and know how to sail a vessel if they have no engine. Of course, the Coast Guard has terrific technology now, but the Coast Guard cadets go on this vessel to learn sailing, to learn navigation, and to learn how it used to be, I suppose. Again, the Eagle is shown here with a chopper next to it. Coast Guard choppers did not come in until about 1942. They were invented in Connecticut. They started to be used in the 50s and 60s here in northern New England. And as you've seen by the Bounty, they're very valuable. A fixed, a regular airplane will spot a sinking ship, as they did with the Bounty, and then they can give the coordinates to the chopper so a swimmer can be dropped down. But this is part of the modern Coast Guard, the helicopter helping out along any vessel that is used. But here is a wonderful photo with the Eagle. One of the largest changes in the Coast Guard was as a result of 9/11. The Coast Guard did an enormous service to New York and other places, picking up people off of the Battery and taking them to safe spots, securing hundreds of ports and harbors. As you folks may recall, people didn't know what was going on at that time, but the Coast Guard was dispatched. They did a terrific job. They brought many people off of the island, which some people, if you were below the Trade Center, you couldn't really get back uptown. So that's why it's so important to have someone picking up people near the Battery, which they did. And every coastie remembers where they were on the 9/11 terrorist attack. It might be like earlier generations with John F. Kennedy. Well, I remember where I was when Kennedy was killed. Every coastie remembers where they were when this attack occurred. In my book and in my travels for the last few years, I interviewed a lot of Coast Guard personnel. There are a lot of books about the Coast Guard out there, but I didn't see any that actually talked to the coasties. So I went from northern Maine to southern Connecticut and interviewed people. This is Patrick Brown. He was commanding officer at Station Merrimack and Water Street in Newburyport. He's a very capable leader. He was promoted. He's in Washington now, but he had directorship of Station Merrimack for several years. And one of the things when I went out with him, I said, Patrick, I've always heard that the 47-foot rescue vessel, which he's standing in front of, if it tips over, if it goes over in high seas, it'll come back up and it'll still be running. So he said, well, happily, that never happened to me, but I was on a 47-footer out off of Oregon, which has, very bad seas. I was taking a cadet out to qualify him on this vessel. He hit a wave broadside. Our 47-footer went over and it came back up. And yes, the engine was still running. And he said everybody was strapped in, no one was injured. What was the ride back like? He said the poor cadet was so mortified, so embarrassed, that I just said when he got to the port, that could happen to anybody. You'll have another chance. So he has a good heart as well as some good nautical skills. A local fellow, Paul Rooney of Newburyport, is a commander in the Coast Guard Reserve. There's a reserve, which is full-time. You have a schedule, and you have an auxiliary, which is voluntary and is very active on the North Shore of Massachusetts. But being a true Massachusetts guy and a real salt of the sea, he is also a part owner of Bob Lobster, which is that fine lobster restaurant on the way to Plum Island. So when he has time off, he's still near nautical endeavors. Commander John Christensen, I met him when his Seneca was birthed in Boston. He was actually in the Navy for 3 years before coming over and becoming an officer in the Coast Guard. And, he said, why did you do that? The Navy seems like a good place to be. And he said, well, the Coast Guard, you have a lot to do. There's always a chance to help somebody. In the Navy, unless you're deep into war, there's not a lot going on. But he said with the Coast Guard, you can rescue, you can do marine, environmental elements. There's just a lot to do. So he's a very successful officer, and he was a captain of the 270-foot Seneca. As I said, there are many women in the Coast Guard now. There are 42,000 people in the whole Coast Guard, including auxiliary. And there are about 6,000 women. Megan Cahoon was an enlisted officer in Rockland, Maine. And when I was there 2 years ago, she was the only woman among 33 coasties in Rockland. But she said, they don't sleep in the dorms there. They have apartments. And she said, everybody that she had met was, working well together. And she wants to be a teacher. And so a lot of her responsibilities involved in teaching and orientation. Lieutenant Commander Karen Kutkiewicz was in Boston when I worked with her, and she has since been shipped out to Alaska and other places. She was very helpful to me, though. I was having trouble talking to coasties for the book because they're not used to talking to the media, and there's a security issue. But this is a situation where she said, I think I can get you an interview with the Admiral, and she did. And that really helped me. So in the future, when I was talking to a coastie, even though it had been set up, they're not used to a lot of questions, and I'm a journalist as well as an author. And so they said, why are you asking me so many questions? And then there are other. So to the second question, I said, well, the Admiral, I interviewed the Admiral last week in Boston, and he loves the idea. So yes, your commanding officer does know you're here. And please, let's keep talking. Commander Valerie Boyd is in New Haven. When I talked to her, she was actually involved in a hurricane herself, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the Coast Guard did a terrific job there. FEMA got a lot of bad publicity, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Coast Guard was remarkable. They're credited with helping rescue 24,000 people and aiding in 9,000 medical evacuations. And so she's had a great career, went to the Coast Guard Academy. And I said, as I always do when I finish an interview, is there anything else you would mention? And you've had a great career especially for the last 10 years. And anything else you would mention? She said, well, in the last 10 years, I managed to have 3 baby girls. And my husband's in the Coast Guard, and we're just a happy family. So I thought, wow, to do all this and have 3 girls and, have a good family in Connecticut, is really, she's a very capable person. My new best friend, Lieutenant Poulin is on the right. He's a native of Kittery, Maine, and he was ceding responsibility several years ago to Admiral Songensen, as you can see. Admiral Poulin was very helpful to me because, as I said, just using his name was good. He gave me a good interview. And as part of that interview, when he actually had his goodbye session, he thanked everybody in the office and other officers. And at one point, he thanked his driver. And so I said, it's wonderful that you thanked your driver, but was there any special reason? And he said, well, several years ago, I was asked to throw out the first baseball at Fenway Park. And I hadn't been on a baseball field in decades, and I wanted to get my throwing arm back. So every time we go to a place, my driver and I, to Portland or Portsmouth or Kittery or something, we'd get out of the car at lunch or something and throw a baseball on a field. And I'm happy to say that when I did throw it to the plate at Fenway, it was a good toss, and we were all pretty happy. So I wanted to thank my driver for helping me, getting me into shape. This is a local fellow from the North Shore. He called me up a year or 2 ago and said, I'm retiring at the Maritime Museum after 30 years. Would you come down and sign some books? My first book in this area was Nautical Newburyport. So I said, I'd love to. Is there any special reason why you called me, though? And he said, well, I'm so proud that I was on the cover of Nautical Newburyport because I was the commander of this vessel. We were out at sea. This was on the cover of my book, and see that this was heavy seas. And he said, I was proud of that day. And when I saw it on the cover of Nautical Newburyport, it just brought back memories. So the Coast Guard is a tight-knit group, a hard-working group. And here's one fellow who retired after close to 3 decades, but remembered this day on the North Shore. The Escanaba is another 270-footer, berthed in Boston, like the Seneca, which we just saw. And I noticed, and this is, the day after Memorial Day, the Escanaba just came back from the Caribbean again and, had confiscated tons of cocaine when they, found smugglers on there. So, making sure that there's no smuggling is an important thing for the Coast Guard. And people love the Coast Guard. And I mention it because I have a Facebook page, authordikehendrickson.com, which very few people look at, I must say. But one day I put a picture of the Escanaba there, just like this. And I boosted a little. By that, I mean, it went out to more than just my followers. It went to, throughout this part of New England. But there were 1,800 people were engaged by this thing, and there were 600 likes. And if, I'm not a guru of the internet, but if you get 600 likes, it's a pretty good number. And so I'm attributing that to the Coast Guard and to this photo, not to me. But this is an example of what a Coast Guard cutter looks out to sea. And in the stern, you can see where helicopters land. This is the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. We've talked about it. The Eagle, the vessel we talked about, the tall ship, is at the top of this photo. And since 1986, the Coast Guard Academy has been taking women. In that first year, there are only about 15 made it through. But now it's a much larger group. And I understand this past fall, 40% of the new cadets at the Coast Guard Academy are women. So it's definitely a service that is progressive, it's changing. And I would mention the service academies is the only one, Annapolis, West Point, etc. The only academy where you don't need a congressional appointment. So that's good. You don't need political juice to get in there. You just have to be good. So this is where we end up. This is the station downtown Newburyport, U.S. Coast Guard Station Merrimack River. And they have about 26 coasties there. They don't live there. They can stay overnight there, of course, but they usually live in the community. They have two 47-footers. And every year, I've got to say, there's at least one, maybe a half a dozen very near-death rescues that these 47-footers do. On August 4th, by the way, of this year, they're scheduled to have their annual open house. I don't know if they'll do it because of the virus, but each year in the past, people have been able to get on the 47-footer, take a tour. So that is some of the elements that I learned about when I was doing my latest book, which is New England Coast Guard Stories. And this is Life Along the Merrimack. This is our 50th gathering. It's been great to do this again. We'll be doing this weekly as we did before. And so I want to thank you for joining us and partaking in my slides. And we'll see you next Tuesday. And have a good week. And we're always talk about the Merrimack River, life along the Merrimack. Thank you very much.